next presenter today is Levi Hall, and he can go ahead and start trying to pull up his presentation while I introduce him. But Levi grew up on a small cattle operation just outside of Berthold, attended NDSU, majored in agribusiness under Dr. Bill Wilson. After cramming his 4-year degree into 4.5 years, Levi took a job with ADM BQ in North Dakota and Minnesota. He was general manager of the Beach Co-op for 5 years before assuming his current role just under 1 year ago as grain division manager for Horizon Resources in Williston. So Levi, I see your first slide is up. So you should be ready to go. And thank you for taking time to present to us today.
You bet. My pleasure, Jim. Thanks for having me. First off, a little bit about myself. I've been in the grain business for about 10 years now, since graduating from NDSU, and 7 years of my career here, the last 7, have been trading Durum. A few of my hobbies there. My LinkedIn bio says I grew up on a small cattle operation, and after college found my passion in the fast-paced grain industry, which is probably an understatement for Durum in the last 14 days. But I manage the grain division for Horizon Resources, and we handle about 10 to 15% of the U.S. durum production each year. So it's a market that I follow pretty closely. I thought this slide summed up the durum market here the last 2 weeks. So obviously we're in a Mother Nature market, and we started the year with lots of talk of soybeans going into the ground in northwest North Dakota, which is obviously an anomaly, and was certainly an insurance play against the drought conditions that we were seeing early. Lots of talk about cutting fertilizer rates early and planning for a drought. But those that waited saw some rain. So Dustin in the pre section of this presentation, when just the presenters were kind of talking, made the comment that he's in the garden spot of North Dakota, which who would have ever thought that up here in Williams County, we would be the ones saying that. But Williams and Divide County are certainly much better off than many other portions of the state. You can see here, this was the drought monitor map from last Thursday, which we've kind of seen, and you can see that up here in the northwest corner, we've seen a little bit more rain. We started out probably as one of the worst areas, but that has migrated closer to my home area of Berthold, North Dakota, and across the central North Dakota area. And really, I think that this area here should actually be a little bit bigger. I think it goes up to the Canadian border, a little bit farther west towards Stanley, probably, and then down along the river, certainly to the southern edge of what it shows there. We've obviously seen from NDON here percent of rainfall. This is just for this year to date. Well, I ran it last week, but you can see we've been okay up here in this northwest corner, a nice little pocket where we've gotten some rain. Our southern trade area over here around the Watford City area has seen some rain, enough to get us close to 100%. However, to me, the biggest story is when we look over here at the 2020, so the 2-year rainfall. This is where we start seeing where the problems are really coming from. So if anybody's been showing maps and saying, well, you know, we're not that far off of rainfall, I think you have to look at the 2-year. We came in real depleted. You know, this is the 2-year map, and it didn't rain last year until I moved up here at the end of June. So we've been in a deficit for a while here. So this is the total rainfall that we've seen for the year. In 2017, when I was in Beach Co-op, we had 3 inches of rain, but 2016, we had 114% with a wet fall. So like I said, that subsoil moisture has been a big portion of what's driving a lot of the issues here. You can see that Beaches this year at just under 3.5 inches on the year. So now we talk about the average air temp maximum for the end of July in 2017. And you compare that to the temps that we were looking at. This is again from last week while I was putting the presentation together. We're going to see a lot of upper 90s this week. I believe on this, the average temp is 92.5 degrees, so it's substantially warmer and substantially drier. I know we've seen it in my garden at home and any new trees that we've planted this year. So the drought stress is real. The crops are really feeling it despite the rains that we've had up in this northwest corner. The departure from the average normal air temp is also something that concerns me a little bit. You know, you can see up in this area, the Durum growing area, a lot of us on the North Dakota side are 5 degrees or so warmer than what we normally are with a hot spot here south of the river. You get over into eastern Montana, it's a little bit closer to average, but still on the warmer side. So then we look at the Canadian side of the border, and you can see Alberta's showing some dryness down here, Saskatchewan across the entire thing, and then Manitoba also seeing some issues with their drought as well. Maxar had this map right here where you can see the percent of normal precipitation, so substantially lower here up north of the border as well. And then seeing the same thing that we saw with their temperatures rising compared to normal. So these are degrees Celsius over average. Once again, substantially warmer, much like we've seen. So we're going to talk a little bit about the crop conditions. So what we've seen here is a nice little garden spot along the border, that Crosby, Noonan area, seeing some beautiful crops that, you know, Durum could potentially run 60 bushel an acre, definitely going to be north of 40. We've got some area here where we're going to have a good crop, but not a great crop in this yellow zone. I would say it's going to be pretty common to hear of 30s. But you're also going to see some spots that are 40s and some spots that are 15 to 20. So we're just going to see a high variability, and it's going to be who caught the showers. You know, in my opinion, again, you can see the guys that planned for a disaster and got that disaster by cutting rates on fertilizer and inputs. To me, the guys that spent the money, you can tell at 70 miles an hour and 70 feet. But the guys that put their money in, their crop looks okay. This gray area right here, we saw a band of grasshoppers move through, which I believe was briefly mentioned, but it was actually so thick that at the end of June here, the Doppler radar picked it up as a storm, but it was actually grasshoppers moving through this area. So we do have a lot of concerns here. There was some chemical used, and those guys saw some advantages from it. But the guys that didn't, we've seen this crop eaten pretty well down to just the stalks. So again, it's pretty spotty here, but there's still too many days left for me to feel comfortable about the grasshopper section, and just a little bit less rain. It seems like a lot of the storms haven't really materialized until they've gotten east of Plentywood, Montana here, and kind of same with Regina. So along that line right there is where the storms have kind of formulated. And then if you go, you know, just west of Moose Jaw, all the way out to Calgary and down, we've got an area that it might produce about 10, 15 bushels. I think the good fields are going to go around 20 bushels per acre. I don't have the Golden Triangle on here. I believe we've got some really good conditions over there. Again, not great. Probably more so similar to this yellow zone where there's going to be some fields that run in the upper 30s and some fields that run in the teens. So a little bit of variability. In my last stomping grounds here down around Beach, we've got areas that are probably going to get zeroed out. Lots of guys that are saying that the crop is really struggling in that area. Some growers that told me they don't expect to turn a wheel on their combines. So, you know, that's a million and a half bushels that are going to come out of our balance sheet for Durum. So, you know, you look at the acres planted, and we've been on a downtrend, which is not uncommon across all of the wheat complex. We just see less and less acres going in. Luckily, we've seen uptrend of production off of those acres as our varieties have gotten better. Weather patterns have been more advantageous for growing, lots of different things. But U.S. and Canada, we've seen the growth in the acres has really come north of the border. So we've seen from 2012 on growth from about 6.8 million acres up to we're now at 7.25, and we've seen some bouncing around within that, but we're still planting durum acres. We've just seen a shift to a higher percentage of those acres being up north. So this is durum wheat planted by area by state, and you can kind of see that same type of thing where we've seen a little bit of a regression in the millions of acres planted. Over here, you can see the crop ratings. And, the big story is in 2 weeks, we went from 15% poor to 55% poor to very poor. I expect another decline to come tonight, and probably one that will come next Monday as well. Knowing how fast the government will adjust things, I don't think that we'll see the full effects of the heat wave that we had this weekend and how quickly we saw this thing deteriorate play into Monday's report. So I think a lot of the report we're going to see, we've got stuff that's already turning pretty yellow here. And it's not uncommon to see a little bit of a tint start to show up in this area this time of year, but it's definitely early. So, how's that going to affect things? The big thing is, how's that going to affect the fill on these heads? And I think that's something that some of these fields look fairly decent from the road and 70 miles an hour. But when you walk out in them, the fill isn't quite there on the vegetation, the lower vegetation. And then how's that going to affect the fill of the heads? Are we just being fooled and it looks decent from the road and even as you get out in it, but once you start shelling these things out, you find that you've got nothing but chaff. So I think that that's a realistic concern, especially with this heat, and could cause some issues with test weight down the road. So our durum crop ratings, same thing as spring wheat. We're faring much better in North Dakota than Montana is. Compared to the 2020 bar, you can obviously see that we had a much higher good to excellent rating than what we're seeing this year. So average durum wheat yields, I think that this is a fairly accurate number. You talk about average yield, and this is on the average yield on harvested acres. So you have to take out the abandoned acres. And I drove down into South Dakota last week, and down in that southwest North Dakota, you could see a lot of check strips was all that was left, and a lot of wheat that was in circular form. So we're going to see some abandonment this year, especially in southwest North Dakota. I don't know about our area. I don't think we're going to see too much of it up here in the northwest corner. Hard red spring wheat is likely going to go higher with the harvest reports we've heard. I guess that's kind of, I think that this 25 is pretty accurate. So durum production, if we're looking at somewhere in the 37 million bushel area, that's going to leave our balance sheet pretty tight. Cost will drop the Canadian production to 33.6, giving us a 4.8 million metric ton Canadian production. So with that gives us roughly 30 days of use using Mike Kruger's balance sheet remains. Normally we see around 110 days of use. So that's a pretty big deal. Is it going to zero out the balance sheet? Absolutely not. We will see prices where durum will move. If you won't move it, your neighbor will. So we've already we're posting an $11 bid today. We're going to see good profitable numbers. I would say, take advantage of that. Don't get caught trying to just sell the peak. Put your farm in a good position for years to come. So this is the tightest we've seen the balance sheet since 2012. You know, and really on Durum, it's hard to go pre-2012 because any year before that, and yes, we're all thinking 2008, is viewed as statistically irrelevant because of the Canadian Wheat Board and the disbanding of that. So how's that going to change things? Well, the Canadian farmer now gets to make his own decisions on when they want to sell their wheat and market their wheat. So, you know, do we see $20 again? I'm probably more in the camp with Brian, where I think 20 might be a little tricky to get to. You know, do we have a little bit of potential room on the upside? Sure. If the yield monitors speak to numbers that are a little bit more surprising on the good side compared to what we've been expecting, you know, we could see this thing settle back down, or even just settle in right where we're at, because there's no doubt it is a tight balance sheet. So I don't think that it's completely unrealistic to say that we're going to stay above 10 for the year. But again, I think that, you know, my whole family farms, and we had a family wedding this last weekend, and we got to hear lots of, is it going to 20? Is it going to 20? I just have a really hard time buying into that one. Greg Costel's report over the weekend, he had a line in there: there's no point bidding the farmer a higher price today when they are disinterested in selling at any price. It's unnecessarily fans bullishness. And I think that's pretty accurate. You know, we look at what's going on in the market, and just the wild jumps that we saw last week of $1 per day at a lot of these elevators. You know, to me, it feels like we've stabilized out. The market ran real quick, and the farmer quit selling. And I would say I don't expect to see much for farmer sales until harvest is done. And really, I don't know that we're going to see that normal clean out the bins rush that we typically will see this time of year. I think that, you know, what we're going to see is the farmer says, at $11 delivered to the elevator, I'm going to fill my bins as full as I can, and the overrun's going to come to town. So, you know, it's going to be a real interesting year. I think we're going to see a lot of elevators filling up in the countryside, because it's going to be way too risky to plan logistics for harvest when you don't know how much your farmers are going to move at that time of year. So that's my 2 cents on the Durham market. So thanks everyone for having me. And I guess if there's a question or two, I'll be happy to answer them.
Well, thanks, Levi. I guess I learned some things in there. I appreciated your maps, talking on the Canadian crop, and because I think that's been a lot of people's questions is, you know, being says, you mentioned, you know, durum acres have shifted more that way. And in June, they still had a pretty promising crop, and just how quickly, you know, that is set back, and you know, especially with some of the grasshoppers, and even probably even going lower. So thanks again. Excellent presentation. And I believe we got a couple questions, Erica. Oh, you're still muted.
Yeah. So one question, Levi, you addressed the Canadian crop a little bit. Do you have any ideas, or kind of what is your perspective on what their production might be this year compared to last year?
Substantially lower. I've heard a lot of talks of as high as 20% of trend line. That's probably a big step back because we do have some pockets that are still, and those are the higher yielding. You get into Saskatchewan and you're typically a lower, Saskatchewan and Alberta, you're typically a lower yield anyways. To say that even if we talk about the high teens for a yield there, well, in an area that normally produces a 25 bushel, are we really going to pull out that many bushels? I think that Greg Costel is somebody that's got a very good pulse on the Canadian markets, especially Durum. So I don't think that his 4.8 is terribly far off. So again, that puts us still in the black of our balance sheet. We're not saying we're going to run out of Durum hold it because we're going to the moon. It just says that we're going to have good solid prices for the year. I don't think that even takes into account too much demand rationing like Brian talked about. So, if we start saying that we're going to pull some of that back, I don't think it changes the balance sheet too much. We're probably still looking, like I said, in that 30 to 40 days of use left. So, around 10% stocks to use, which is plenty tight. Especially when we've been operating at around 30 to 40% stocks to use. So, I think that it's still a legitimate talking point, but I don't think that Canadian production is going to fall too much under that 4.8 that Greg talks about.
Okay, and you actually addressed the next question. The question was, they mentioned that 4.8 estimate and what your thoughts were on that. So it sounds like you think that's pretty much in line. So
yeah.
So Levi, I guess I have one for you, and you kind of alluded to it, that I think one thing we as producers don't always have a good handle on, excuse me, is the logistics that, just like a lot of producers struggle with, how many bushels should I pre-sell if I'm going to, because I don't know my production. You've got to manage rail freight, you've got the wild card on basis. And so, how much of a challenge to go up the next level for exporters? USDA lowered our export projection to like 15 million bushels. Obviously, if Canada has a smaller crop, I think they've kind of oversold last year's crop a little bit. I mean, are you seeing things from our exporters where they're looking for durum for at harvest type export sales, or is that going to get postponed this year too a little bit?
Well, that's a great question, Jim. I think that what we're hearing is that the U.S. mill market is pretty well bought up through December. So we know that there's some commercial shorts out there. We just don't know who it is and how short they are. That's going to be the thing that drives a lot of the immediate sales, I think, is people that come in and say, I really need to fill a train. But really, I think, we're going to see, to back up and talk about the first part of the question first, the logistics side it's a lot more complex than a lot of farmers realize. So, it's not a flip the light switch and a train shows up. A lot of times, unless you're willing to pay through the nose, you're planning 30 to 45 days out on when those trains are going to land, making your sales in the period that correlates, that type of stuff. So it's a little bit more complex to try and hit those windows and plan a 1 year's worth of freight and whatnot. So to be able to say that we're going to have harvest sales on, I typically have at least one, maybe two sales on during harvest this year. Because of the volatility, I don't have any on right now. So it's going to be very difficult for the farmers to be able to decide how much are we going to bring to town, because if it's not contracted, a lot of these elevators are not going to have guaranteed slots, for 40,000 bushels or whatever a farmer might want to bring to town. So I think it's just going to be a big portion of it's going to be working with your local elevator and saying, hey, I know I'm going to bring some stuff. This is kind of where I'm thinking, even if it's not a contract, just have that conversation with them and let them know to try and help plan. The other part of the question where we were talking about, what's the export market going to look like? I think we know that Algeria is going to have to come in and tender for some durum. Are they going to be able to buy it all from the US and Canada? At $11, we're probably nearing the higher side of what they can afford. You start looking at Mexican durum at that pace. So, I think the reality is that, we're going to start to see a shift in exports at these prices. Brian talked about it a little bit on how we're starting to price ourselves out of a lot of these developing countries. I think we're going to see a very similar thing. Your off-grade durum, we're probably going to see a fair amount of that if there's still some of that crawling around in the bins from 2012 or 2019. We're going to see some of that stuff carry more premium than it's seen in the years past, just because they can take that, buy that cheaper and blend some of this higher quality stuff down and still import. So, and there still is some of that stuff rolling around. I just bought some last week. So, So yeah, I think it's important to keep all of that in mind too.